They told you the M1 Garand was the greatest battle implement ever devised. Patton said it, the history books repeated it. But they forgot to mention the Ordnance Department almost sabotaged its production for years because of a technicality over a gas trap. I spent weeks digging through procurement reports to see how the U.S. infantry actually felt about their gear. This isn't a museum tour. It's a look at how institutional inertia sent boys into the hedgerows with tech from 1918, and why some innovations were just expensive paperweights. We're covering everything, from the pistols that jammed to the bazookas that terrified their own operators. If I missed your grandfather's favorite carbine variant, hit me in the comments. I'm just one guy with a mountain of manuals. Let's get into the mud. Chapter 1. Sidearms. In the grand strategy, a pistol is a rounding error. It's what you use when the system has already failed you. But for the guy in a trench with a jammed rifle, that rounding error is the only thing that matters. Let's start with the legend that everyone thinks they know, the M1911A1. To the brass, it was the ultimate symbol of American stopping power. But for the administrative machine, it was a logistical challenge, a heavy, expensive-to-manufacture chunk of steel that the Ordnance Department struggled to supply in the millions. It was reliable, but the bureaucratic insistence on the .45 caliber meant every soldier carried a 2.5-pound anchor for a ballistic performance that rarely saw use. Here's the gritty reality. The manual told you it was a lifesaver, but combat reports showed GIs often traded them for extra rations. The recoil was so punishing for raw recruits that the system had to implement massive training cycles just to keep soldiers from flinching. It was a weapon designed for professionals, handed to teenagers who often found it more intimidating than the enemy. When the 1911 production lines redlined, the system reached back to 1917. This revolver was a stopgap measure, a literal ghost of the Great War. It forced logistics officers to manage half-moon clips just to make rimless auto rounds work in a rotating cylinder, an administrative nightmare born of industrial desperation. If you lost those tiny metal clips, your high-tech revolver became a slow-loading paperweight. In the mud of Europe, these clips were the first thing to disappear. It's the perfect example of how a small tactical vulnerability in the supply chain can render a rugged piece of engineering completely useless under stress. Then you had the detective special, the administrative shadow of the war. Not for the front line, but for the couriers and intelligence officers. The bureaucracy recognized that in the business of sensitive transit, a full-size pistol was an operational liability. It was a discrete tool for a massive, loud war. It's proof that even in total mobilization, the system understands nuance. The detective special didn't win battles, but it ensured that the people moving the paperwork stayed protected without drawing unnecessary attention from the very sabotage units the system feared most. The M3 trench knife was supposed to be elite, but the paperwork couldn't keep up with the demand, and soon every unit wanted one. It was a response to the brutal administrative reality that modern war still required a sharp piece of steel when the magazines ran dry. Paratroopers strapped these to their legs, but not for combat. The primary drop system often left them hanging in trees. The M3 was a survival tool against the military's own gravity-induced errors. It wasn't about fighting the enemy, it was about fighting the equipment. Finally, the Mark I, a leftover from 1918 that ignored every rule of modern logistics. It was heavy, expensive, and completely incompatible with the standard-issue webbing of 1944. It was a weapon looking for a war that had already ended. GIs hated the brass knuckles because they couldn't hold a rifle properly. The field modification was simple. They ground the guards off. They destroyed a piece of history just to make it functional. That's the ultimate deconstruction of a Washington-designed wonder weapon. Looking at the data, the Army's close-quarter strategy was about filling industrial gaps with whatever the supply chain could produce. Whether it was a precision 1911 for psychological comfort, or a repurposed trench knife from 1918 that required field grinding just to fit the gear, you carried the institutional compromise of the weak. Chapter 2. The Backbone. This is where the bureaucracy meets the mud. While the sidearms were a rounding error, the rifle was the primary investment of the American industrial machine. It's here that we see how the system's obsession with semi-automatic fire changed the very math of the front line, turning a single infantryman into a logistical black hole for ammunition. The M1 Garand, the Army's pride. It offered a massive leap in operational output, But the institutional rigidity of the en-bloc clip created a unique administrative headache. You couldn't just top off the magazine. The system demanded you either exhaust all 8 rounds or engage in a clunky manual extraction that the manual didn't exactly encourage. It was efficient, provided you followed the machine's rhythm. And then there's the physical cost of the mechanism, the Garand thumb. It wasn't a combat injury, but a systemic byproduct of a high-tension bolt design. Thousands of GIs suffered this minor administrative delay in their personal efficiency because the weapon's closing cycle was faster than human reflex. It's the perfect metaphor for the era, man serving the speed of the machine. The M1 carbine. This was the system's attempt to bridge the gap between a heavy rifle and a pistol. It was the administrative solution for non-combat roles, radio operators, mortar crews, and clerks. But as the war expanded, the bureaucracy pushed it into the front lines, ignoring the fact that its .30 caliber round was essentially a stretched pistol cartridge masquerading as a rifle round. In the frozen Ardennes, the carbine's ballistics became an operational joke. Soldiers reported that the light bullet struggled to punch through thick, frozen German greatcoats at distance. It was a weapon of convenience that often turned into a liability when the human variable was wearing an extra layer of wool. For the airborne, the bureaucracy authorized the M1A1, a variant designed for a jump bag, not a gunfight. It featured a folding wire stock that was a masterclass in portable inefficiency. The War Department prioritized storage volume over ergonomics, forcing paratroopers to manage a weapon that rattled and wobbled exactly when stability was a life-or-death requirement. The wire stock was so uncomfortable that GIs often wrapped them in field jackets or scrap leather just to get a decent cheek weld. It's a perfect example of a specialized design that ignored human physiology. The system gave them a compact tool, but the soldiers had to finish the engineering themselves just to make it usable. Even in 1944, the ghost of the Great War remained in the supply chain. The M1 903A3 Springfield. The Ordnance Department kept this bolt action in production because the industrial machine simply couldn't stamp out enough Garands. It was a reliable fallback, an admission that the arsenal of democracy still had to rely on a design from 1903 to fill the statistical gaps in the ranks. These rifles arrived at the front packed in much-maligned, a thick, soul-crushing grease that took hours of administrative labor to clean. While the manuals promised a weapon ready for action, the reality was a GI spending half a day scrubbing his equipment with gasoline just to make the bolt move. It was a tax on soldier efficiency, paid to the gods of long-term storage. The M1903A4. This was the system's optical compromise. Instead of designing a purpose-built sniper platform, the Ordnance Department simply pulled standard A3 receivers off the line, slapped on a Weaver scope, and called it a day. It was a bureaucratic shortcut that removed the iron sights entirely, leaving the marksman with zero fallback options if the fragile glass fogged up in the European rain. The 2.75 times magnification was so weak it barely qualified as a sniper tool. In the thick hedgerows of Normandy, GIs often found it less effective than a standard Garand in skilled hands. It was a weapon that performed better on an administrative spreadsheet than it did in the hands of a specialist trying to identify a camouflaged target through a hazy lens. Looking at the stats, the Army's rifle strategy was a battle between semi-auto innovation and industrial lag. You were either carrying the cutting-edge Garand with its rigid clip system or a bolt-action relic from the previous generation because the factories couldn't keep pace with the logistics of total war. Chapter 3. Suppressing Fire. This is where the budget went from precision to volume. We're moving from the backbone to the muscle. The weapon's designed to vomit lead until the administrative resistance breaks. But as we'll see, some of these muscle designs were more interested in fighting their own weight than the enemy. The Thompson M1A1. Hollywood's favorite, but the Ordnance Department's most expensive headache. By 1942, the system had stripped away the cooling fins and the drum magazines just to make it manufacturable in a total war economy. It was a masterpiece of over-engineering, 10 pounds of steel and wood that provided massive volume at the cost of being a logistical anchor for the man carrying it through the mud. GIS called it the Chicago typewriter, but the reality was simpler. It was twice as heavy as the carbine for the same effective range. The system prioritized the .45 caliber's kinetic reputation over the soldier's physical endurance. It's the ultimate example of institutional inertia, clinging to a heavy, pre-war design because the industrial machine was too invested in the tooling to start over. Then came the M3, better known as the grease gun. This was the bureaucracy's pivot toward extreme industrial efficiency. It wasn't built, it was stamped out like a car fender. For the War Department, it was a triumph of cost-cutting, a weapon that cost $15 to produce, while the Thompson cost over $200. It was ugly, crude, and an honest admission that quantity had become its own administrative quality. The early models featured a literal hand crank for cocking the weapon, a mechanical failure waiting to happen in the field. It was so unreliable that the system eventually deleted it, telling soldiers to just stick their finger in the bolt to cock it. It's a rare moment where the bureaucracy actually simplified a design by admitting their first cost-saving solution was an operational disaster. The M1918A2BR, the Army's tactical anchor. It was supposed to provide mobile suppressing fire, but the Ordnance Department's insistence on a heavy bipod and a magazine capacity of only 20 rounds created a paradoxical weapon. It was too heavy for a rifle and too limited for a light machine gun, a brilliant 1918 design, struggling to fit into the high-volume administrative reality of 1944. The institutional manual insisted on the bipod for precision, but the operational reality was different. G often ripped them off and threw them in the bushes, just to save 5 pounds of dead weight. It's the ultimate field deconstruction, soldiers sabotaging their own equipment's specs, just to regain the mobility the system had calculated away. The data on automatic weapons reveals a massive gap between industrial cost and infantry endurance. Whether it was the over-engineered Thompson or the stamped-out grease gun, the infantry carried the weight of the system's evolving manufacturing philosophy. Chapter 4. The Heavy Hitters. Now we enter the realm of logistics, where infantry weapon starts to feel like a clerical error. These are the tools that broke the stalemate: mortars, flamethrowers, and the rockets that gave the individual soldier the administrative authority to stop a tank. But as we'll see, that authority came with a terrifying operational tax. The M1 bazooka. This was the system's asymmetric solution. Before 1942, a single infantryman had no administrative authority to stop a tank. Then, the Ordnance Department handed him a steel tube and a rocket, effectively democratizing anti-tank warfare. It was a masterpiece of simplistic logistics, a weapon that cost almost nothing to produce, but forced the enemy to rewrite their entire armored doctrine. But that authority came with a terrifying operational tax. The early M1 models had a nasty habit of showering the operator in unburned propellant. It was a violent negotiation between man and machine. You got the power to crack a Tiger tank, but you paid for it with facial singes and a signature backblast that announced your exact coordinates to everyone on the map. It was effective, provided you were willing to accept the systemic risk. The M2-2 flamethrower. This wasn't a weapon of precision, it was a tool of administrative clearance. When the bureaucracy encountered a fortification that refused to follow the rules of surrender, they sent in the incendiary teams. It was 70 pounds of liquid death strapped to a single human spine, a logistical nightmare that turned a soldier into a slow-moving, highly flammable tactical vulnerability. The system gave you exactly 4 seconds of operational output before you became a dead weight on the battlefield. GIs hated the weight more than the risk. 70 pounds meant you couldn't run, you couldn't hide, and you were the primary target for every sniper in the sector. It's the ultimate example of the system asking for a total physical sacrifice in exchange for a few moments of absolute tactical dominance. The M260mm mortar, the Army's pocket artillery. This was the system's way of giving the company commander his own private ballistics department. It was a masterpiece of modular logistics, a weapon that could be broken down into 3 administrative loads, allowing the infantry to carry a level of explosive authority that previously required a truck or a horse team. But portable was a relative term in the Ordnance Department's dictionary. The weight was so punishing that it forced a permanent 3-man tax on the unit's manpower just to keep it operational. GIs often found themselves choosing between carrying enough shells to be effective or carrying enough rations to survive the week. It's the ultimate bureaucratic trade-off: mass-produced firepower at the expense of individual mobility. The data on heavy support shows the true price of, quote, stopping power. Whether it was the rocket tube or the fuel tank, the infantry was forced to carry the massive physical burden of the system's most violent administrative solutions. So when we step back and look at the actual 1944 ordnance procurement tables, three systemic truths about the American infantry machine become perfectly clear. First, the U.S. infantry didn't just fight an enemy. They fought a massive, lumbering industrial machine that often prioritized manufacturing ease over human ergonomics. If a weapon was heavy or clunky, the system simply expected the soldier to adapt to the engineering failure. Second, the arsenal of democracy was a house of cards, held together by logistics. For every high-tech Garand on the front line, there was a crate of 1903 Springfields, or ancient revolvers, waiting in the shadows, because the bureaucracy couldn't scale up fast enough. Total war isn't about the best gun. It's about the gun you can actually deliver in the millions. And finally, the real war was won in the foxholes, with a file and some grease. The GIs took the flawed, rigid products of Washington's committees and spent their few moments of peace re-engineering them into tools that actually survived the mud. But hey, that's just what the paperwork says. Maybe your grandfather had a different experience with the M1 carbine in the Pacific. Was the weight worth the firepower? Or would you have traded that Thompson for an extra gallon of water? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious to see if the archives missed something.